Shalom Aleichem. We're honored this evening to have Moreno Rav Schachter here with us tonight. Again, one part of our Beit Midrash initiative, the Beit Shemesh Community Beit Midrash Initiative, which started over 5 years ago with the help of all the community shuls, Eitz Chaim, Nofei Aviv, Nofei Shemesh, Oel Yonah Menachem, Netzach, BMTL. And of course, I want to thank Yeshiva University of Israel, Stephanie Strauss, for all her help and support. And of course, one of our definite favorites in our shiurim in terms of the most popular is always Rav Schachter Shlita. And I just want to give a quick thank you to Melissa Moshe Raymond for helping with the technical stuff, with the website and with the Zoom count and everything else. Thank you so much, Melissa and Moshe. It will be very, Rebbe, if it's okay, we'd like to ask you a few questions at the end of your shir. And thank you. I heard from Rabbi Raz in one of his shurim on Pesachim about the halacha about are you allowed to do haseva for Talmid Eitzel Rabo? And the question is, what does that mean? And the Gemara and Rav Razner speaks about it in different ways. One means it's like an apprentice. One, and then Rabbi Razner quotes the Rav Zechet Pesachim as saying, no, it could also refer to two different types, Svei Dinim, two different types of Talmid Etzel Rabo. One could be someone who takes on a few of the Nihugim, but not all the Nihugim. And then there's some Talmidim that follow the whole Geschäft, both the learning, both the understanding, both the Mahos. And we have with us this evening Rav Herschel Schachter Shlita, who has been providing us Torah and been leading the Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary for many years since the Ptira of the Rav Zatzal, and he has been carrying the banner of Torah of the Rav and the torchlight, the Medura of his Torah throughout the world. And we're just so grateful. Rav Schachter we'll talk about this evening. It's a sort of pre-Yortzeit shir for the Rav. The committee thought that it would be appropriate, since the Rav was nifter during Chol Moed Pesach, that we wanted to be able to bring the Torah Sarav of Pesach before the Yortzeit, so that we could, because the Rav's Torah is so powerful of Pesach, and we thought no one would be better than Rav Schachter to share with the Torah, Lachal Maisa, the Torah Sarav, etc. So without further ado, Moreno Rav Schachter, thank you so much for coming.
Mazel tov to all of the Mesayim Masechet Pesachim. I have to admit, I did not finish the Masechta. I don't have a chance to learn Daf Yomi. I work for a living. I have to give shiur here and there and everywhere. I don't have a chance to learn what I want to learn, but Mazel tov to all of you that you made a siyum. Traditionally, when you make a siyum, so the Mesayim speaks a little divrei Torah on the last Mishnah. So the last Mishnah presents a machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. We have a rule in Bichas Hanenin. If you're eating, let's say I'm eating a baked potato that has some butter melted on it and has salt on it. So when you eat butter and salt, the bracha is shahakal. When you eat a potato, the bracha is bar pi hadama. So if you have your baked potato with the salt and the butter, you have to say two brachas or one bracha. So there's a Mishnah brachas, the birach aloika patas atvela. If you're eating two foods together, and one is clearly ikar, one is a tafel, so you only say bracha on the ikar, there's no need to recite the bracha on the tafel. So there's a question, does this idea that ikar and tafel, does this carry over from bichas hanen and the bichas ha-mitzvah as well? If you're doing two mitzvahs, and you said a bracha on the ikar, would that part of the tafel? Or do you say no? Maybe there's no such thing as an ikar and tafel by mitzvahs. So the Mishnah has a machlokes hatanoim. So Rabbi Shmuel is of the opinion. Taisus quotes the Talmud Yerushalmi, gives this pshat. The Bavli doesn't sound like it's saying this, but Taisus, there's a gigantic Taisus on Kuf Chaf Aleph and Aleph on the last Mishnah. The Yerushalmi learns that this is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, that Birach Alika Patas Hatvela carries over from Bichas HaNenin to Bichas HaMitzvah. And the Chagigas Harba Aser is a tafel to the Korban Pesach. We assume halacha lamaisa on Pesach Shavuot Sukkot there's an obligation to bring a Chagiga to shech the chagiga an yontif. Shechting the chagigas arba'asa on Erev Pesach, that's only midrabanan, in order that the korban pesach should be nechal ala sova. So the korban pesach is the ikar, and the chagigas arba'asa is the tofel. So Rabbi Shmuel is of the opinion that birach alo ikar patas atfela. If you said a bracha on the korban pesach, there's no need to say a bracha on the chagiga. But if you said a bracha on the chagiga, you still have to say a bracha on the korban pesach because birach ala tofel does not pata the ikar. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. So the question is, Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Does he agree in principle that Iker and Tafel carries over to Birchas HaMitzvah also? He just disagrees here. You can't really label one as the Tafel of the other. Or does he disagree in principle? That he holds that the whole din of Birch Halika Patas HaTfela doesn't apply at all to Birchas HaMitzvah. So that's a little unclear. Exactly, according to the Yerushalmi, what exactly does Rabbi Akiva, what point does Rabbi Akiva dispute with Rabbi Yishmael? So the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, once in a long while, the Rambam has Chazara, backs up from what he wrote in the Pirush HaMishnah. So here, an Arvei Pesachim regarding Charoisis is one of those rare cases. The Mishnah has a machlokes hatanoim between Rab Lezer, Rab Tzadik, and the Chachamim. What is Charoisis all about? So the Chachamim, the majority opinion seems to be that Charoisis is only for medical purposes, for health reasons. The Mora may have a worm in it, and the worm is a kosher worm. Taisus discusses that, which worms are kosher, which worms are not kosher. So the Mora may have a worm, but it's not healthy to have live worms crawling around in your stomach. So maybe we have to dip the Mora into Charoisis in order to kill the worm, that it shouldn't be unhealthy to eat it. So is that the whole reason for Charoisis? Or maybe there's a mitzvah. Now, Charoisis is not going to be a mitzvah in the Torah. There's no pasuk in the Chumash. So Rab Lezer Rab Tzadik is of the opinion, the Mishnah quotes, Rab Lezer Rab Tzadik disagrees with the Chachamim. He thinks that that Charoisis is a mitzvah midrabanan. Basfa mitzvah, what's the mitzvah midrabanan? So the three explanations given, two in the Bavli and one in the Yerushalmi. One explanation in the Bavli is Zecher Letit, to reminisce about the cement that our ancestors used to use in order to build Pisam and Ramses, in order to build all of those buildings. And the other explanation is Zecher Tapuach, because the men worked so hard, they didn't want to have any children, they didn't want to be with their wives at all. They were so exhausted at the end of the day, they wanted to go to sleep, they wanted to drop dead, they didn't want to do anything. And the women would make love to the husband, tachas atapoch haraticha. And the schusam nashim tzidkani is nigal abasenim mitzrayim, because the women felt there is going to be a gula, and we should have children in order that we should continue. The Jewish people should continue. So the Gemara says these are the two reasons given by the Gemara. The Gemara says to satisfy the both explanations, you should first make charoisis that should be thick, zecher letit, to reminisce about the thick cement, and then you should pour in some liquid later in order to be able to dip in the mortar. What liquid should you pour in? So the Yerushalmi says that the idea of charoises being a mitzvah midrabanan, according to Rab Lezer Rab Tzadik, is zecher ledam, to reminisce about all the Jewish blood that was spilled in Egypt and throughout all the generations. So you should use red wine. That when you have the thick charoises, you should pour in red wine. That it says in the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, unless you live in an area where there's a chashash of alilas adam, which unfortunately, even in the early 20th century, there were alilas adam. Middle 20th century, there were alilas adam in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and in other places. So then you use white wine. Okay. And tachas atapuach haraticha, so Taisus points out in the end of Masechet Tainis, tapuach doesn't mean an apple. The people say, the experts say that in Eretz Yisrael in the days of the Tanaim, they didn't have any apples growing at all. So tapuach, Taisus says, means a citrus fruit, esrog. Tapuach means a citrus fruit, and that's what it says in the Gemara. Because of that opinion, tzorach lekuhuye, you have to have as one of the ingredients of the charoises, should be like an orange that should have that acidic flavor, spunky flavor that's sharp. Apples don't have any sharp flavor. So Gemara says, tzorach l'semuche, it should be thick, zecher l'sement, and tzorach l'kuhuye, should have a little orange, squeeze some orange juice, and it should have the red wine, Zechel Adam. So the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos writes that we obviously don't pass on like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik. If the din would be like him, all the Haggadahs would, some Haggadah should have another bracha. Shekrishana b'mitzvaysav b'tzivanu al achilos chayroises. So the fact that no Haggadah has such a nusach is an indication that we don't pass on like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah backed out. The Lechem Mishnah points it out. The Rambam backed out. He paskins like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik that it is a mitzvah mid'Rabbanan, and nonetheless he says that you don't recite a bracha. It's a chazara. The Lechem Mishnah points out it's a double chazara. He backed out. He paskins like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik. It is a mitzvah mid'Rabbanan, and despite the fact that it's a mitzvah, one does not recite a bracha. Just before you go further, it's interesting that the Rambam writes in the Pirush HaMishnayos the bracha that there would have been, if the din would have been like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik, the bracha would have been that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to dip the more into the charoises. The Rama holds you dip the matzah into the charoises, you dip the karpas into the charoises. The Rama holds you dip everything into the charoises except for the korban pesach. But why does he say that you would have said a bracha al achilas charoises? Interesting. So it would appear from the Ramam in the Pirush HaMishnayos that if you would hold like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik, charoises mitzvah would be a mitzvah to eat a kazayis of charoises. This is quoted in Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah quotes this, that on Erev Pesach, just like you shouldn't eat matzah, so you shouldn't eat any fruits that are going to be incorporated into the charoises. So the Ramah says, he quotes this in Shulchan Aruch, and he says he doesn't understand what it means. Who eats charoises? You don't eat charoises. You only dip the mar into the charoises. But apparently there was such an opinion floating around in the days of the Rishonim that if you hold like Rab Loza Rab Tzadik, not only they have to dip the mar into charoises in order to kill a worm for health purposes, you're supposed to eat a kazayis charoises. If you look in the Mordechai has a kasha that the Gemara says that the Beis Habliya, the throat, you cannot swallow too gigantic a piece of food. You can only swallow, the Beis Habliya is only machzik kebetza. So and there's a machlokes harishonim, how much is a kazayis, a chatzi beitza or a shlish beitza? So the Magen Avraham says we always go lechumra. Badinim deraisa you go lechumra, badinim derabbanan you go lekula. I remember Rabbi Schwab Zichron Levrach used to be the rabbi here in the neighborhood in Broyas Kehillah. So in the last years of his life, he was not permitted to eat bread, cake, or cookies at all. He had some kind of a medical condition. So he said Shabbos and Yom Tov, he didn't eat bread, cake, or cookies at all, only the first 2 nights of Pesach. And he ate the whole meal. Then at the end of the meal, he would wash. That's the way it says in Shulchan Aruch. You only have 1 kazayis of matzah. You can't say hamoitz in the beginning of the meal and then have a comment at the end. He only has 1 kazayis. He's only allowed to eat 1 kazayis. He was willing to risk it for his health, only to eat 1 small kazayis. So the first night of Pesach, after he finished the whole meal, he would wash and say on until he said, "Diamond eat chatzi beitza," because the first night Pesach is deraisa. He had a chatzi beitza of matzah shmura, and the second night Pesach is only the rabbanos. They had a shlish beitza. So the Mordechai printed in the back of the Rif quotes a kasha from earlier Balei HaTosfos, from earlier Rishonim. How can they possibly swallow a kazayis of matzah, kazayis of maror, and a kazayis of charoisis at the same time? 3 kazaysim, he's working on the assumption that kazayis is chatzi beitza. So how can you swallow 1.5 beitzim of food if the Beis Habliya is only machzik kebeitza? Who says you have to swallow bevasacha? So that's a whole discussion. The Magen Avraham quotes the Trumas Hadeshen, and lechatchila you shouldn't eat a little bit, a little bit more. Preferable, the mitzvah b'shleimus is to swallow everything bevasachas. So the Mordechai quotes this kasha. How is it humanly possible to swallow 3 kazaysim? That's a beitza or machza. So it comes up in an answer when the Gemara says the Beis Habliya, the throat can only swallow at one time. A kibetza, that means if it's a hard-boiled egg and you're swallowing it solid. But if you're going to chew it up, then you can swallow a beitza and a half, bevasachas. So the way it says in our editions of the Mordechai, his question was, you're having a kazayis matzah, kazayis maror, and a kazayis of charoisis at the same time. So they have the Hagos Haramah in the Mordechai. They put Kazais Charoises in parentheses, and they put in brackets, it should say Kazais Korban Pesach. You're eating Pesach Matzah Mar. Hillel used to eat Pesach Matzah Mar. So that was the kasha. How can he eat Pesach Matzah Mar? But because the Ramah writes in the Shulchan Aruch, nobody eats Kazais Charoises. Why can't you eat? It doesn't make sense. A minig not to eat fruits on Erev Pesach in order to eat the charoises letiyaban, you don't eat charoises. You dip the mar into the charoises. But there was such an opinion floating around in the days of the Rishonim that according to Rab Loz Bar Absadik, there's an Indian to eat the kazais charoises. So again, so the Lechem Mishnah points out that the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah had chazara. He backed out from what he wrote in the Pirush HaMishnayos, and it's a double chazara. First of all, he paskins like Rab Loz Bar Absadik. Charoises is a mitzvah, and secondly, despite the fact that it's a mitzvah, one does not recite a bracha on eating the charoises. In the Pirush HaMishnayos, he thinks the din is not like Rab Loz Bar Absadik, but haraya, if the din would have been, then you would have said there would have been a Haggadah that has an extra bracha al achilas charoises. My father learned by Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, so my father told me Rav Moshe Soloveitchik would sometimes say, when you have a contradiction between the Rambam and the Pirush HaMishnayos and the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam backed out, but before he backed out, he was also a Rambam. So it's a machlokes, the Rambam and the Rambam. So you have to break your head to understand what was the Rambam shita before he backed out. You don't just say he backed out, so we'll ignore that. Just like if there's machlokes, the Rambam and the Ravid, or the Rambam and the Rashba, you have to explain each shita. So if you have machlokes, the Rambam and the Rambam Kainam Chazor, the Rambam after Chazor, he was a Rambam before he backed out also. So you have to explain that. So the Lechem Mishnah tries to explain, according to the Rambam, in the Mishnah Torah, that charoises is a mitzvah. How come one does not recite a bracha like he wrote in the Pirush HaMishnayos? So he says, no, Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Shmuel that there is a din of Iker and Tofel and mitzvahs, not only by Birchas HaNenen, even by Birchas HaMitzvahs. He disagrees that Korban Pesach and Chagigas HaBasa, neither is an Iker, neither is a Tofel. So you got to say two separate brachas on the Korban Pesach and on the Chagigas HaBasa. But if you have charoises is clearly a tofel to the maror. The main purpose of the charoises is to dip the maror into it. So it's a real iker and tofel, so no bracha is recited on the tofel. Rab Soloveitchik didn't think that that was the correct pshat in the Rambam. He didn't think that it's based on iker and tofel. It's still unclear whether Rabbi Akiva disagrees in principle, maybe disagrees in the principle of Rabbi Shmuel, maybe holds iker and tofel has no shaychus at all to birchas hamitzvah. So Rab Soloveitchik gave a different explanation. He said, since the whole mitzvah midrabanan of charoises is either zecher letit, or zecher letapuach, or zecher ledam, the three explanations given by the Bavli and Yerushalmi, whenever you have a mitzvah that zecher, so bracha is not recited. Whose idea is that? So the Chok Yankif, on the bottom of the page in the big Shulchan Aruch, they have the Chok Yankif. So the Chok Yankif quotes from the Sefer HaOruch. The Aruch was one of the Rishonim, the days of Rashi. So the Aruch has a comment, why don't we recite a bracha when we have Zecher L'Migdash Kehilo? Why don't we recite a bracha? I don't know exactly what the question is. He said a bracha al achilas matzah and al achilas mara. So it says in Shulchan Aruch, you shouldn't be mafsik in between that bracha al achilas matzah, al achilas mara, and the eating of the kairach. So the bracha, the kairach is covered with a bracha. I don't know, but that's what the Aruch raises a question. Why don't we recite the separate additional bracha when you're about to eat the kairach? So the Chok Yankif quotes from the Aruch, a bracha is not recited when a mitzvah is only for the purpose of zeicha. Why not? What kind of a reason is that? Why not? So the Rav explained, when one is mekayim, a lot of times when mekayim a mitzvah, you don't say a bracha when you have a kiyam mitzvah. A bracha is recited when you do a maisa mitzvah. Let's say l'mashal. Let's say a person cannot climb up on the ladder to nail up the mezuzah. So he asks the next door neighbor, could you do me a favor? Can you put up the mezuzah? So the next door neighbor is fulfilling a mitzvah gemilas chasadim. But who is fulfilling the mitzvah mezuzah? The one who lives in the house is fulfilling the mitzvah mezuzah. But who says the bracha? The one who lives in the house does not say any bracha at all because he has the kiyam mitzvah, but he didn't do the maisa mitzvah. The maisa mitzvah is done by the next door neighbor, but he doesn't recite a bracha. Asher kedushanim himself tzivana ligmal chasadim. The mitzvah gemilas chasadim. He says the bracha likvaya mezuzah. The bracha is recited by the one who does the maisa mitzvah, not by the one who has the kiyam mitzvah. There's a Magen Avraham. in Orach Chaim, where the Magen Avraham writes, if I move into a house that has mezuzahs from the previous tenants, and the mezuzahs are kosher, previous tenants were reliable people, so one does not have to put up your own mezuzah. It has a kosher mezuzah. So what bracha do you recite? So the Magen Avraham invents a new bracha. Shekerishana b'mitzvah tzivano ladur b'abayis sheyesh bo mezuzah. So the Birkei Yosef by the Chidot at the end of Hilchas Mezuzah and Yeridei Chel Gimel, Birkei Yosef says nobody holds like that, Magen Avraham. You move into a house, you're not doing a Ma'aseh Mitzvah. You only say a bracha on mezuzah if you do the kviyas on mezuzah. If you have when you live in the house with a mezuzah, there's a kiyam on mitzvah, but you're not doing any Ma'aseh Mitzvah. No bracha is recited. Such a similar Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham writes, if it's ben hashmashos already, and the woman didn't bench lichtet. So the Mishnah says, "And madlik and safcha hashecha savikeina hashecha ein madlikim esaner." It's a safek deraisa lechumer. It's a ben hashmash. It's a safek lailo. So you're not allowed to do a malacha. Not even allowed to do a malacha derabanan either. It's a safek deraisa. It's naget to dinim derabanan. But it's not. It's a safek deraisa. Is it Shabbos or not? It's not a safek derabanan. It's a safek deraisa that has ramifications in the area of malacha deraisa and a malacha derabanan as well. So that's safek deraisa lechumer. So the Magen Avraham, so it's in the Shulchan Aruch, the accepted opinion is that Amir al-Nachri is mutter bein hashmash. It's a special kula. Amir al-Nachri is mutter bein hashmashes if there's a great tzorach. So I can have the Nachri if the balabasta forgot to light candles and it's going to be dark in the house. Not that she left on the lights the whole day, Friday the chandelier is on. The whole room, the whole house is dark. So that's a tzorach gadol. So you permitted to ask the Nachri to light the candles ben hashmashes. The Nachri cannot say a bracha shekerishana b'mitzvah tzivana. He is not a Yisrael. So the Magen Avraham says the balabasta should recite when the Nachri lights the candles. The balabasta should recite the bracha shekerishana b'mitzvah tzivana lahadlik ner shal Shabbos. So the later Achronim disagree. Mishkanas Yankev is the whole tshuva in the Sefer Koheles Yankev. He disagrees. He says, "What do you mean the balabasta is going to say a bracha? But she didn't do the Ma'aseh mitzvah. You only recite a bracha when you do the Ma'aseh mitzvah, and that when you have a kiyam mitzvah." The Rav had many rayas to this, that Birchas HaMitzvah is only recited in connection with Asiyas Ma'aseh mitzvah, but not in connection with a kiyam mitzvah. So Rav Soloveitchik thought that that's the pshat in that Aruch. Why does the Aruch say that no bracha is recited when you make when you're fulfilling a mitzvah for the purpose of zecher? He said that whenever there's a mitzvah, the zecher, let's say zecher l'mikdash kehilo, you want to reminisce. So the eating of the koruch is not the Ma'aseh mitzvah. There is no Ma'aseh mitzvah. You conjure up the mitzvahs to conjure up in your mind what it looked like in the days of the Beis Hamikdash when Hillel would eat the koruch. He would eat the koruch matzah mara b'yachad l'kayim hashenemer. So there's a kiyam mitzvah b'machshava. You're being maharer. You're visualizing in your mind what life was like in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, but there is no Ma'aseh mitzvah. So Rav Soloveitchik thought that's probably what the Aruch meant, and he thought the same is true regarding charoses. If charoses is either zecher l'dam, or zecher l'tapuach, or zecher l'tit, whatever the zecher is, there is no Ma'aseh mitzvah of eating charoses. There is no Ma'aseh mitzvah, period. You conjure up in your mind an image, you're reminiscing in your mind about what it was like tachas hatapuach haraticha, when the women would make love to their husbands. Or what would it be like when our ancestors made the pyramids, when they made Pisam and Ramses? And what was it like when they spilled all the Jewish blood? So whenever there's a mitzvah that's only a zecher to reminisce in your mind, then there's no Ma'aseh mitzvah by definition. The whole mitzvah is only to have zechrinus, to think about something. So if there's no Ma'aseh mitzvah, there's no bracha. So Rav Soloveitchik thought that his pshat was better than the Lechem Mishnah. Lechem Mishnah thinks that the reason why the Rambam doesn't say a bracha on the charoses, even though it's a mitzvah, because you have an ikar and a tofel. Some of the Rishonim say that also. I think the Tur, some others write like that also. So Rav Soloveitchik thought that wasn't why. He thought whenever you have a mitzvah, that zecher, bracha is not recited. The Gemara on the last daf here on Kuf Chafalach and the Bavli, it doesn't seem to say the same as the Yerushalmi. It doesn't talk about Iker and Tofel at all. It could be that that's pshat in the Bavli, but the Bavli doesn't mention a word about Iker and Tofel. The Bavli presents it as follows. The Chagigas Arba Oser is a Shlomim. Chagiga is a Shlomim. And you do Shtei Matana Shein Arba. You do 2 Zrikas in the diagonally opposite corner of the Mizbech. You do 2 Zrikas. So that's called Zrika. You do a Zrika Meirachik. The Korban Pesach, Rashi quotes, is a Machlokes Hatanan where they do Zrika or Shvicha. And we really paskin that you do Shvicha. Shvicha means you stand next to the Mizbech and you pour it on the side. Instead of standing a little far away and doing a Zrika Meirachik, they do Shvicha Mikorev on the side of the Mizbech. So the Gemara says, Machlokes Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel is, do you say that Shvicha is a higher, the Korban Pesach needs Shvicha. They say Shvicha is a higher form of Zrikas Hadam. So if you would have done the Chagigas Abasa with Shvicha, it would have been good. But if you would have done Zrika on the Korban Pesach, it would be no good. But he's saying, no, Shvicha is not Bechlal Zrika. Zrika is not Bechlal Shvicha. They're 2 different forms. So it's questionable whether the Babli is also based on the Rishalmi's idea of Iker and Tofel, or it's a totally different shot. Rav Soloveitchik pointed out in the Nusach that we say in the Haggadah, we pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kein Hashem Elokeinu yagienu lemoyadim u'legol machim habon v'kvasenu l'shalom smechem b'vinyan yirecha v'sasem b'avodesecha v'nechol shem erazvachim min ha'psach ma sheyagia damam al kirim zbechacha le'ratzon. So we hope that next year, maybe this year for Pesach, maybe we'll bring a Korban Pesach this year. But on Leil HaSeder, Bizman HaChurban, we didn't have a Korban Pesach, so we pray for next year. Maybe we'll Nechol min Azvachim min Apsachem Asher Yagia Damam. Why do you say Asher Yagia Damam? Why don't you say Asher Yizriku Mi Damam? So the Rav suggested because the Chagigas Abasa has Rika, the Korban Pesach has Shvicha, so it's going to be a whole Maisa. You're going to have to, and you're taking a stand because some Tanaim disagree. The whole Korban Pesach is also Bizrika, not Bishvicha. So we don't want to get involved, and we don't want to say 2 different Lashonos. One Lashon for the Korban Pesach, Sheyishafech Damam, and one Lashon for the Chagigas Abasa, Sheyizarek Damam. So you say Sheyagia Damam. However, Sheyagia Damam, Al Kim is Bachacha Le'ratzon. That's what Rav Soloveitchik suggested. This Mishnah is very Peladik Mishnah, this last Mishnah. The din is, there's a Ruah, is one of the later Bali Ataysa. There's a Ruah was a Talmud of Rabbi Yudah Silion, and then the Talmud of there's a Ruah was in Maharam Rutenberg, and the Talmidim of the Maharam Rutenberg were the Rosh and the Mordechai August Maimon at the end of the Kufa of the Bali Ataysus. So the Ruah is bothered with a kasha on this Mishnah. Those of you who learned Yeridei and Yeshiva will certainly remember the Shach and Simon Yutes quotes this Ruah. The Ruah is bothered with a kasha. If you eat an Iker and a Tofel, you only say a bracha on the Iker. No bracha is recited on the Tofel. That's if you're eating them together. Let's say I have the baked potato and I have some melted butter on it and I have the salt on it. So you don't say 2 brachas, Shahakal and Bar Pi Adam. You only say Bar Pi Adam is the Iker and the Tofel is covered with the Bar Pi Adam. But over here, which do you eat first? So the din is that the Pesach is Nechal Ala Sova. First you eat the Chagigas Abasa, then you eat the Korban Pesach later. So how can you say Birch ala Pesach, Poter is a Birchas HaZevach? You only eat the Korban Pesach at the end, Nechal ala Sova at the end. First, in order that it should be Nechal ala Sova, first you eat the Chagigas Abasa. So you're eating the Tofel before the Yikr. So how can the Yerushalmi say that it's an issue of Birch Alika, Poter Satvela? You're eating the Tofel before the Yikr. So you have to say a bracha on the Tofel. So the Azarua says the Mishnah, you have to give an Ukimta Pshat in the Mishnah. You have to say the Mishnah is talking about a funny situation, a B'diavad situation. The person ate the Chagigas Abbas and he forgot to say a bracha. And then after he finishes eating the Chagigas Abbas, and then at the Montzach, he reminds himself he forgot to say a bracha, but now he's up to eating the Korban Pesach. So should he say 2 brachas? 1 bracha on the Chagigas Abbas that he ate already, and then he says the next brach al achilas haPesach, and he eats the Korban Pesach heseba. Or he say no? Why should he say 2 brachas? It's an Iker and a Tofel. Now he's holding. He already ate the Chagigas Abbas. Now he's holding by eating the Korban Pesach. So let him just say the bracha on the Iker al achilas haPesach and part of the Tofel. That's how the Ozarua says. So the Shach quotes this Ozarua that this is in disagreement with the Rambam. The Rambam writes a few times, Kol ha-mitzvahs kulam mevarach aleim oival asiyosam. The bracha must be recited in advance of the mitzvah, And if you already, let's say, you already did the mitzvah, and let's say, you start to daven, it's too early, it's before Masechet Chaver in the morning. So you put on the talis and tefillin, but you're not supposed to say the bracha, l'sat b'tzitzis or in the tefillin. Then it becomes later, it becomes Masechet Chaver. So the people should say the bracha. They should finish Psukkah de Zimmer. Then you say the bracha on the talis and tefillin in between Yishtabach and Yoitzer. If it's still before Masechet Chaver, so then you say the bracha on the talis and tefillin after Tachnun, or after Chazaras Hashatz and Chodesh Nisan, when there is no Tachnun. Okay, they say after Chazaras Hashatz. What if the person took off the tefillin? He already took off the talis and tefillin. Then he reminds himself, hey, I never said the bracha before I put it on because it was before Mashiach, and by Yishtabach also it was before Mashiach, and then I forgot to say the bracha after Tachnun or after Chazaras Hashatz. I forgot. So what does he do now? So the Rambam says, Farfalm. Mashanase Kranase Farfalm, it's too late. You can't say the Birchas HaMitzvah after. The Birchas HaMitzvah always has to be recited. If you're still wearing the talis, you're still wearing the tefillin, so it's still Oivalasiyasam because you're going to continue to wear the talis and tefillin later. But if you already took off the talis and tefillin, if it's an hour later, it's too late. Even if it's immediately later, the Rambam says you can't recite a bracha. And the Ozarua disagrees with that Rambam. The Ozarua doesn't quote the Rambam. He never quotes it. He didn't have a Rambam. But the Shach points out the Ozarua disagrees with the Rambam. Holds a bracha may be recited Lachar Asiyasim. So the Rav had his famous biur on this Rambam Shita. Why does the Rambam hold like that? Mashanase Kvarnase says the Rambam writes in Hilchas Brachas, he writes a line, just like Hishem shetikna chachamim bracha birchas hanenen, kach tikna chachamim a bracha birchas hamitzvah. What do you mean, Kishem? It's a different bracha. This is shakal bedvara, and that's lahaniach tefillin. There's two different brachas. What does it mean, Kishem? So the Rav understood, right? Yosef Engel has this also, same rayas. So the Rav understood that just like Birchas Hanen is a matir, also you have to recite a bracha in order to get hanoah. So with the Rabbanon, they made a takana. It's also lasas mitzvah without reciting a bracha. The Birchas HaMitzvah is matir you to do the mitzvah. With the Rabbanon, you can't walk up to the White House and knock on the door and say, I want to talk to the president. They'll put you in prison. The government will put you in prison. You have to make hachanas in advance. You have to make an appointment. So you can't. The Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't want you just to run in to do a mitzvah. You have to ask rishus. So the Birchas HaMitzvah is mata you to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be allowed to do the mitzvah. So the Rav, he explained a lot of things with this Rambam. And he said, this Rambam, that the Rambam says, you can't say a bracha l'achar asiyosam. That's like the Shach quotes the Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara says, if a person already ate the food and he forgot to say the bracha in advance, so you can't say a bracha now after you finished eating to be matal mafreya. It can't be matal mafreya. He already did the Yisa Asalanis Madala Mazebela bracha, unless he has still some more food left. So then he says a bracha in advance of what he's going to continue to eat. But if he already finished eating, has nothing more to eat, he can't say a bracha later. And that Gemara, the Shach points out, that Gemara puts together the Birchas HaMitzvah with the Birchas HaNenin. You shouldn't be able to say Birchas HaMitzvah after you already did the mitzvah. Sounds from the simple reading of the Gemara, the Shach says that the Birchas HaMitzvah is also Mater Asiyas HaMitzvah. You already upketon, you already did the mitzvahs. Mashanasa Kranasa. It's too late. You can't have a Mater. I remember I attended once a wedding. The grandfather of the Kala was Masadi Kedushin. Grandfather of the Kala was a prominent rabbi. He had been Masadi Kedushin many, many, many times. More times than I was in my lifetime. He was in a big shul, famous shul. He was a famous rabbi. He was so excited over the fact that he's being Masadi Kedushin by his granddaughter. He had the chassan give the ring, and then he forgot to say the Birchas Eresin. He was ready to start reading the Ksuba. So everybody screamed out, you didn't say the Birchas Eresin. So we happen not to paskan like the Rambam. That's what the Shach discusses in Simiyut Tes. Do we paskan like the Rambam? Masha Nasa Kvar Nasa. If the chassan already gave the ring for Fallen, it's too late to say the Birchas Eresin or not. So the pashtus is that we don't. There's a Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah writes in Simiyut Tes, in Hilchas Birchas Hashchita, what if an animal fell down a flight of stairs? That's called nefula. So the Gemara says in Eila Trefus, if an animal fell down from a high location, you have to be concerned. Maybe the ribs maybe some of the ribs cracked, and maybe the edge of the rib made a hole in the lungs. And a nekev in the reya, if there's a hole in the lung, makes the animal into a treifa. So if you shecht in a fula, you have no way of telling in advance whether there's any hole in the lungs. So if you shecht in a fula, you don't say the bracha in advance because it's a latest asafik, maybe a bracha levatala. Because we paskin that when you shecht the treifa, no bracha is recited. They quote in Shulchan Aruch, Rashi's opinion is even when you shecht the treifa, since the shchita is metar medena vela, so there is reason to say a bracha, but we don't follow Rashi's shita. We hold you only say a bracha ala shchita if it's going to be a kosher shchita. If you know in advance that it's a treifa, a suffix treifa, you don't say a bracha. So by the nefula, you don't say a bracha until after you do the shchita, you cut open the chest and you check. And if you see that the animal is not a treifa, then you say a bracha. So that's a discussion in the Masechet Pesachim on Siman Yotes. Is that because we don't paskin like the Rambam? Or maybe since you weren't able to recite the bracha in advance, maybe it's like a ger. The Gemara says the ger cannot say the bracha ala tefillah before he's teifel because he's not Jewish yet. So he can't say Kedishana b'mitzvah v'tzivanu. So because Akati Gabra Lachazi, he wasn't able to say the bracha before. So then, Kach Tikna Chacham, he should say the bracha after. That's what some of the Masechet Pesachim say. Not that the Shulchan Aruch paskin like against the Rambam, like the Ozarua, that by nefula you say the bracha lachar asiyasam. No, we really paskin perhaps like the Rambam, that you can never say a bracha lachar asiyasam. But if the animal is a suffix treifa, you weren't able to recite the bracha before. So in this instance, the bracha has to be recited after. So that's a machlokes. You'll see in Siman Yotes and Yeridea. Machlokes that I said, whether the Shulchan Aruch is paskin like the Rambam or not. I remember one summer, I was giving a shiur for a group of Rabbi Goldwicht's Talmidim. They were learning Kiddushin, so I invited my next door neighbor, was a big Talmid Chacham, a very prominent Talmid Chacham. He passed away already since then. This was a Maisa of 15 years ago. So I invited him. He was a prominent Maggid shiur, so I said, you should give a shiur for them. They were learning Ksubis. So he spoke about his first Seder Kiddushin. He said the first time he was Masechet Kiddushin for one of his Talmidim, he was so nervous, he forgot to say the Birchas Eresin, like the Meiser Shohay with the grandfather. So he was so careful the Chosin should give the ring, say Hariyat, and so on. Then after he gave the ring, he realized that he forgot. So he discussed this din. So he said he had no choice. He said the bracha lachar asiyasam. He thought that we don't paskin like the Rambam. We paskin like the Ozarua. But this is the Ozarua's rayas from this Mishnah. And Rav Soloveitchik, every time he spoke about the Inyan of Birchas HaMitzvah, he would always mention the Rambam Shita seems to be that the Birchas HaMitzvah is matir, Asiyas HaMitzvah, because he writes Kishem shetiknu Birchas Hanen and Kach tiknu Birchas HaMitzvah. It sounds like the Birchas HaMitzvah is matir, just like Birchas Hanen is matir da'anoah, so to the Birchas HaMitzvah is a matir Asiyas HaMitzvah with the Rabbanim. In our Torah, you don't need a matir with the Rabbanim. You need a matir. Next to the last parak in Pesachim is all about Pesach Sheni. And in the Chumash, Pesach Sheni for the one who's Tomei b'derech rechoika. What's the definition of derech rechoika? So there's a machlokes hatanoim. So the Rambam paskins, if the Rambam has a different sheet, the Rashi and Tosfos say derech rechoika is established. Where are you at Chatzos on Erev Pesach? Erev Pesach at Chatzos is when you become obligated to bring the korban Pesach. So if you at Tesvav Mil, you draw a circle around Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the center, and on the circumference is the city Modi'in. Min Modi'in ve'lifnim, and that area enclosed in the circle, that's called Derech Krova. And if you're outside of that circle, that's called Derech Rechoika. Why should it be Tesvav Mil? Why should it be Modi'in? So the Gemara has the whole calculation in the 9th parak. The person who's traveling to the Beis Hamikdash by foot will be able to walk Tesvav Mil from Chatzos till Shkia. Before Chatzos, the Chiyuv Korban Pesach doesn't begin, and you can't bring the Korban Pesach after Shkia. Dam Nifsal b'Shkia Sachama. So how far can your average person walk from Chatzos to Shkia? So the Rambam writes Tesvav Mil. The Rambam happens to have a different sheet. He says it depends on Zvichas Hashemish. Will you arrive in Yerushalayim by Chatzos? Rashi and Tosfos learn, no. Where are you at Chatzos? Will you arrive in Yerushalayim before the Shkia? So the Rambam writes that it's Tesvav Mil. So that after the Nadi Yehuda passed away in the 1700s, the Talmidim of the Nadi Yehuda had a big dispute. What is that based on? The Gemara says the average traveler travels in the course of 1 day's traveling 40 mil. That's Esa parsos. Every parsa is 4 mil. So the average traveler will walk 40 mil. And in half a day from the Chatzais to Lishkiya, the Rambam says from the Zvicha to the Chatzais, he will walk 12 mil. Okay. So if he can arrive within a half a day, by Korban Pesach, it's only a half a day, from Chatzos to Lishkiya, according to Rambam, from Zvicha till Chatzos. If he can arrive in a half a day, so then it's called Derech Kraiva. If he's too far away, it's Derech Chok. Even though he has access to a horse, he's going to go horseback. He's going to drive by car. He's going to get there in a half an hour. It's not going to take him so long. It's not going to take a half a day. The Gemara says, nonetheless, the halacha depends on the average traveler who is walking by foot. So the Talmidim of the Nadi Yehuda had a machlokes. He passed away, so he wasn't involved in the machlokes. During their lifetime, they developed trains, so you can travel much faster. So they were wondering, this did in the Gemara, that Tesvav mil, you draw a circle around Yerushalayim, and the radius is Tesvav mil. Is that only applicable to the Baisheni period and before, that the average traveler would travel by foot? What about now that the average traveler is not going to walk so far by foot? The traveler will go by train, or go by a bike, or go by a car, by horseback. He's not going to go. Ruba de Ruba are not going to go by foot. Maybe today we should have a different shear. Maybe it should depend on every generation what the rove of the people, how the rove of the people would travel. Or is it no? Maybe it's halacha Moshe Messina kach nemar halacha. It goes on the average travel of Bisman Matan Torah is going to travel by foot. So they write, look, when the third Beis HaMikdash will be built, Moshe Rabbeinu will come back, there'll be Tchias HaMeis, and we'll be able to ask Moshe Rabbeinu, what do we have to break our heads now? So they say, no, the issue is Negeh today also. It's Negeh Halacha L'Maisa today, but Negeh to Avelis. The Gemara has a din. Most of the dinim of Avelis appear in Perek Elam Megalchen, the third Perek in Masechet Ma'id Kotten. When the Mishnah and the Gemara discuss all the dinim of observing Avelis on Yontif and Shabbos and Chalamoid and so on. So the Gemara has a din. A person comes to visit his parents. He had no cell phones. He has no communication in the days of the Gemara. He comes to visit his parents. He finds out the family is sitting Shiva. One of the parents passed away. And he comes in the middle of Shiva. So the Gemara says, if Bomi Makim Korev, Mani Imam, Bomi Makim Rachik, does he have to observe 7 days of Shiva? Or do you say, no, they're holding already on the 4th day, on the 7th day in the morning. Just another 10 minutes. The Menachem are going to be Menachem Baba. That's going to be the end of the whole Shiva. So we paskin, even if the relative came the morning of the last day of Shiva, one opinion is only if he came within the first 3 days. So we don't paskin like that. We paskin even if he came the morning of the 7th day. If he bought me Mokum Koreb, then money. So what's the definition of Mokum Koreb? So Tosfos quotes the Rif, who quotes the Bal Halachas Gedolos, that Mokum Koreb means 1 day's traveling. So by Korban Pesach, it depends on a half a day's traveling. According to Rashi and Tosfos, where are you at Chatzos? Will you be able to arrive in Yerushalayim by Shkia? So that's the distance of Tesvav mil. So he draws such a circle. But here, it doesn't depend on a half a day's traveling. It depends on a whole day's traveling. So how much is a whole day's traveling? So it says, Esa Pasos, within 40 mil is Makam Karev, and outside of 40 mil is Makam Rochek. So that's the question. 40 mil is Makam, after more than 40 mil is Makam Rochek. That was in the days of the Mishnah, where the average person would go by foot. But today, which Meshugan is going to walk all day long? 40 mil. He's not going to walk. He's going to take a train. He's going to go by car. He's going to go by horseback. Not going to walk by foot. So maybe the definition of Makom Korev changed Bisman Hazeh. So that was a machlokes among the Talmidim of the Nadi Yehuda. Nadi Yehuda had passed away already, so he wasn't able to express his opinion. But the Talmidim had this machlokes. So they said, what's going to be when they build the Beis HaMikdash? Well, they ask Moshe Rabbeinu. There'll be Tchias HaMeisim, they think. They'll ask Moshe Rabbeinu. But what's the din meanwhile? So they say, halachik dera mekel ba'ovel. Whenever there's a machlokes, we always go to Kula in Hilchas Avelis. Not only do we go to Kula, if it's a Hilchas Avelis shaila, Here it's a shala that's negir to a din deraisa by Korban Pesach. The original din of Makom Rachik is relevant for Korban Pesach. If you are Makom Rachik, even if you sent a message in advance, they should be shech the Korban Pesach for you. The Gemara says you're not Yotze. If you are Makom Rachik at Chatzais, you're out of the parsha of Korban Pesach Rishon. You have to bring Pesach Sheni. So even though this machlokes starts in Hilchas Pesach, maybe in Hilchas Pesach we would be machmer, but in Hilchas Habelis we go lekula. Whenever there's any machlokes Hilchas Habelis, we always go lekula. It's interesting. There is a machlokes Tosfos and there is a Ruah regarding observing Habelis Erev Pesach after Chatzos. Tosfos in Zvachim and Daf Kuf holds explicitly that one does observe Habelis. On Yontif, one does not observe Habelis, but Erev Pesach is not yet Yontif. And the Ozarua disagrees with the Bali Atais. The Ozarua holds that Erev Pesach after Chatzos is also a Yontif. So if one is in the middle of Shiva, so when it comes Chatzos, it cancels Shiva. One already finished Shiva before and in the middle of Shloshim, when it comes Chatzos, it cancels Shloshim. So the Ramah in Yeridei, Hilchos Habelis, Paskins like the Ozarua. So there's a Sefer on Shulchan Aruch written by Ablaza Moshe Horovitz. He was the Rav in Pinsk, I think. He was a contemporary of the Beis HaLevi. They learned a Maloshin at the same time. And some of the tshuvas in the Beis HaLevi were written to him. Tshuvas about Saita were written to Ablaza Moshe Horovitz. So in his Sefer on Shulchan Aruch, so he raised the question, why did the Ramah paskin like the Ozarua? He should have paskin like Taisa. Taisa is more prominent than the Ozarua. So he says because it's Havelis. And halachi debra mekel ba'avel. Even though maybe the Shita of Taisus and Zochem Daf Kuf represents the majority opinion, but when it comes to Hilchas Habelis, even if it's only a minority, we would say Halacha Tibra Mekel Ba'avel. So that's why the meaning is Lahakel. The Shaila is what happens every year, the people dying every day of the year who never died before, that's for sure. And there's going to be someone who's going to be buried Erev Pesach after Chatzos. So they really treat it like Yontif. So someone is buried on Yontif, you don't begin Shiva till after Yontif is over. So if you really follow that sheet of the Ozarua, that you don't observe Avelis, then Hakavres Mesa Erev Pesach after Chatzos, he has to observe all of Shiva after Pesach is over. The last day Yontif Pesach counts as the first day of Shiva because it's Feika the Yoma. Then he only has to observe 5.5 days after that. And on the morning of the 6th day, you say Mitzayim Kukulai. So should you say Halacha? We pass like the Ozarua, and he say, no, halacha, you go the kula, whichever is going to make life easier for him. So maybe we should say he should take off his shoes. And Erev Pesach after Chatzos, the Abel should take off his shoes. He should be Noeg Avelis like Tosfos. So he'll only observe for an hour or two. And then after Pesach, he won't have to observe Shiva. Because if you do like the Ozarua, that you treat Erev Pesach after Chatzos like a Yontif, then he's going to have to observe 7 days of Shiva after Yontif. So halachi debra mekel ba'avel means you don't observe Avelis. So it means whatever will shorten your niyog Avelis should be observed. So I think the common practice is that the people, whenever there's a Gvura Erev Pesach after Chatzos, they do observe Avelis a short period of time. Then they assume that Yontif cancels it. They assume halacha debra mekel ba'avel, whatever will come out lahakal at the end of the day. So they'll only observe Avelis for 2 hours. They won't have to observe for 7 days. But that's very questionable. Is that really the pshat? The pashtus is that halach devan mekel ba'avel means you only observe Avelis if it's a vadai. If there's any suffix, you don't observe. So Erev Pesach Heftach and Tzais, there is a suffix. So you shouldn't observe at all. You should wait till after the Yontif is over to observe the 7 days of Avelis. But my impression is that that's the common practice. One of the recurrent themes in Rav Soloveitchik Shiurim is the theme of Kol the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein the Raisa Tikkun. Whenever we learn a Gemara that had a Din the Rabbanan, so the Rav would always try to discern where is there a Makar and Chumash that this Din the Rabbanan is rooted in. I didn't realize it till after I published my Sefer Eretz HaTzvi, the first Sefer that I printed. So one of the Balabatim who participated in my Queen Shir, read through the whole Sefer. He said, that's the recurrent theme in my Sefer. I didn't realize it. Then I realized that was a recurrent theme in Rav Soloveitchik Shiurim. So when we learned Pesachim on the opening Mishnah, Rav Soloveitchik raised the question, Bedikas chametz. So we usually assume bedikas chametz is midirabanan. The Gemara says midiraisa bebitul bial masagi, and it's only bedikas, only midirabanan, and therefore the Rabbana will make certain kulas because bedikas chametz only the Rabbana. Taisus has one opinion on Daf Tes Daf Yud. Taisus has one opinion that bedikas chametz only the Rabbanon if you were mevatel. If you weren't mevatel yet, then the chivas bedika will be deraisa. So in Shulchan Aruch, the two opinions are quoted. Is bedika always the Rabbanon, or is it only the Rabbanon if the person already was mevatel and they're nafkaminas lahaloch? So Rav Soloveitcher was discussing where did this idea come from? Where did they get such an einfall that bedika should be deraisa? Or if bedika is only the Rabbanon, so why did they introduce bedika? Bir chametz is the chametz that you're aware of. You destroy if you don't know one way or the other. So you're not mechuyev. Where did they get the einfall that you're mechuyev to be badik? So he mentioned that there's a mitzvah bir abadizar. It says v'nitatzumis mizbachosam mishibartam smatzevosam asherem tesu from boesh sila lahem tigadem. There's a mitzvah to destroy abadizar. So here in Teaneck, 4 years ago, I think, a religious family bought a home from some Orientals. And then after they bought the home and they moved in, the next door neighbor was Jewish. And he told them, you should know that the tree that's planted in front of the house is an Asherah tree. The Orientals bought it and they planted it l'shem avodah zarah. Every morning they would dress up with Big Day Shabbos and they would bow down to the tree and offer prayers. And then they would switch into Big Day Chol. And the children would go to school and the parents would go to work. So that tree is mamash and asher, was planted l'shem avodah zarah. So this Jewish person who bought the home had to chop down the tree, had to burn it, and then he had to pour in poison in order to kill the roots under the ground. The roots were very deep under the ground, so he couldn't yank out all the roots. So you had to pour in poison to destroy that also. So that's the din b'chutz la'aretz. Bir avodah zarah. Bir avodah zarah chutz la'aretz only if I buy a house and there's an avodah zarah there, so I have a mitzvah to burn the avodah zarah. In Eretz Yisrael, the Gemara learns out from the pasuk Abeti Abdun, the Keif Loshen, that Eretz Yisrael tzarich l'sharish achareh. It's not enough that when you see avodah zarah and it's a public location, so Yeshua ben Nun and Bnei Yisrael should destroy the avodah zarah. They should search out tzarich l'sharish achareh. You have to search out to find where avodah zarah may be hidden in order to clean out all of Eretz Yisrael. So because there is such a concept on the level of the Raisa, there is a mitzvah bir avodah zarah, and bedika is the haschala of the bir by avodah zarah in Eretz Yisrael. So that's called the tikkun rabbanan kein the Raisa tikkun. It could be that they introduced, if one should assume, or if you hold bedikas chametz is the Raisa, calls manshal abita. Where did they get the bedikas the Raisa? They got it from bedika bir by avodah zarah. Just why? Why should the Gemara have this idea called the tikkun rabbanan kein the Raisa tikkuns? Why did they have to, when they formulated mitzvahs and the rabbanan, dinim the rabbanan, they pattern after concepts that exist on the level of the Raisa. The building blocks of halacha have to be ideas that exist on the level of the Raisa. Why? So I thought that the Rav once made a comment on the Sefer Mitzvahs Rambam in the first Shorish. The Rambam says, Rambam has 14 guiding principles that determine which mitzvahs belong in the Sefer Mitzvahs and which not. So the first klal is you only include mitzvahs deraisa. You don't include mitzvahs derabbanan, because all the mitzvahs derabbanan you're obligated to observe based on the pasuk lo sasur. So all the dinim derabbanan are included there. So the Ramban has a whole attack against the Rambam. What do you mean? All dinim derabbanan are binding on the level of deraisa because of lo sasur. There's so many differences between the din deraisa and din derabbanan. Safek deraisa luchum, safek derabbanan lekula. So how can you say that all the dinim derabbanan are binding on the level of deraisa? So Rav Soloveitcher said there's such a big hullabaloo over there, such a literature, and the machlekas, the Rambam and the Ramban. He said he never understood what's the big makol arash hazeh. That was his lashon, makol arash hazeh. He thought that when the Chachamim introduced a din derabbanan, it blends in to become part of the Torah Shabbat Peh on the level of deraisa, and when you learn it, you'll be in fulfillment of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah on the level of the Raisa. To use his lashon, he said, all the dinim derabbanan become a chefza shel Torah on the level of the Raisa. When you learn it, there's a mitzvah of Talmud Torah the Raisa. But the chayvus hagavra, as opposed to chefza shel Torah, the chayvus hagavra to observe it, that's clearly only med derabbanan. He said there's no machlokes the Rambam and the Ramban. They both agree to the same thing. They both agree. The dinam derabbanan become a chefetzer shel Torah min haTorah. When you learn it, you're in fulfillment of Talmud Torah deraisa. But the Chovos HaGav is only midirabanan. So because the Chovos HaGav is midirabanan, so that's why you say Sveika derabanan lekulam. He gave a mashal amad avadayme. The Gemara says in the end of the first parak in Erev, and I think you Gimel and Beis, the Gemara says regarding the many disputes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, Elu divrei Elokim chaim. What does it mean? So some people misunderstand the Gemara. You can do whatever you please. If you want, you can follow Beis Shammai. If you want, you can follow Beis Hillel. That's not what it means. The Gemara says. The Gemara says, we absolutely do not paskin like Beis Shammai. You don't even mitzarfit to make us svek. We don't consider Beis Shammai shita halacha l'maisa at all. But means if you spend time learning Beis Shammai shita, that constitutes a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Why? Because the Beis Shammai were working with the midrash haTorah and Reshes behem. They came up with different maskanas from the Beis Hillel, but because they were working with Midrash HaTorah and Rashem, so all of their shittas blend in to become a chefetzer shel Torah on the level of their rice. So if you start a Beis Shammai shita, you're learning Torah, but Chovos HaGavra is zero. There's no Chovos HaGavra at all. So that's what Rav Soloveitchik thought with respect to all the dinim derabanan. A chefetzer shel Torah it is min haTorah. If you learn it, you're mekayim the mitzvah of Talmud Torah midiraisa, but the Chovos HaGavra is only midirabanan. He thought that there should be a kal v'chomer from Beis Shammai shita. Beis Shammai Mishalei Mishnah. You don't follow it all halacha l'maisa, and still it's a chefetzer shel Torah. So the dinim derabanan certainly so. My impression was that that's befair. This idea, the Rav didn't mention this. This idea kemat beferish in the Rambam and the Hakdama to the Pirush HaMishnayos. The Rambam writes the Mishnayos represent the Torah Shebal Peh, and he says that there are 5 parts to the Torah Shebal Peh. He says halacha Moshe Misinai and Perushim HaMegubalim LaMoshe Misinai, Ayat HaChasayin, and so on, and Purei Tzada means an Esrog, and then he says drushes based on the Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah and Drushes, and these are all Torah Shebal Peh. And then the Rambam writes that the 4 and 5, the 4th and the 5th sections of the Torah Shebal Peh are the Gzeros de Rabbanon and the Takonos de Rabbanon. So it sounds very clearly from the Rambam. It sounds like he's saying all the dinim de Rabbanon blend in on the level of the rice to become a chelik, an integral part of the Torah Shebal Peh. So I thought maybe that's the reason why there's such a kpeda called the Tikkun Rabbanon Kain de Rice. Tikkun, all the dinim Rabbanon have to be patterned after dinim de Rice. You have to work with concepts that building blocks of halacha, even halacha de Rabbanon. The building blocks have to be concepts that exist on the level of the rice. So that's why the Rav is always looking for what's the called the tikkun, what's the Kain de Rice tikkun. So here on Bedikas Chametz said the Kain de Rice is Bediko Biur in a by Avodah Zarah and Eretz Yisrael Tzarich L'Shara Shachareha. The Mishnah in Brachos has a machlokes hatanoim regarding the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. At Pesach night there's a mitzvah of Sipa Yetzias Mitzrayim, and all year long, it says in Parshas Re'eh, we should bring the Korban Pesach on Erev Yonta Pesach. So the Pshuto Shal Mikra is that that's the Tam HaMitzvah. That's the reason why the Rebbeinu Shalom instructed us to bring the Korban Pesach, so that all year long we'll remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the Torah Shebal Peh has an additional level of interpretation. The Pshuto Shal Mikra clearly is like that. The Laman Tizkar, that's the Tam HaMitzvah of Korban Pesach. But the Torah Shebal Peh has an additional level. We interpret the word Tizkar as if it were written Tazikir. The verb Zayin Chaf Reish sometimes means Lizkar Belev, and sometimes it means Lahaskir Bepeh, to mention. So the Torah Shebal Peh has an additional level of interpretation that we should mention Yetzias Mitzrayim Kalei Mechayech. So that's why we say after the first 2 parshas of Shema V'Hayam Shemaya, we say Vayomer because of the last pasuk. We mention Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the pasuk says Mantiskas and says Kol Yemei Chayecha. So the word kol is a riboy. So what is it marba? So that in the Mishnah and Brachos, that's a machlokes hatanoim, the end of the first pair. So one Tana says that it's marba limos HaMashiach. The chiyuv is the Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim every day by Shachris, by Yom, not by Laila. So you don't have to say Parshas Vayomer by Ma'ariv, only in Shachris. But that chiyuv will last kol lahavi limos HaMashiach. Even after Mashiach will comes and we will experience the Gula Hasidah, there'll still be a mitzvah of mentioning the daily mitzvah Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. We do not paskin like that. We paskin kol goes on leilos, that you have to say by Yom, and not only by Shachris, by Ma'ariv as well. And Limos HaMashiach, we assume the mitzvah of Sipi Yitzias Mitzrayim on Pesach night will still apply, but the mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim will no longer apply. And that's the psukim in the Navi. The Navi says, "Lo yamar ad Chai Hashem shehela eschem eretz mitzrayim." We will no longer talk. The daily mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim will no longer apply, because the Gula Hasidah will be so overwhelming, will be so wonderful, so exciting. We will forget about Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, the daily mitzvah. We'll only mention on Pesach night the Sipa Yitzias Mitzrayim. So that's a machlokes hatanai. So the shaila is the way we paskin la halacha, that there is a chiyuv every night, every day, every night by Shachris and by Ma'ariv to say the third parasha Yitzias Mitzrayim. So what is different on Pesach night? On Pesach night is a night like every other night. You have to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim. So why is it different? So that's where Rav Soloveitchik used to say part in the name of Rab Chaim and part he added on himself. There are several nafkaminas la halacha between Sipa Yitzias Mitzrayim on Pesach night, which is much more, and Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, which is shorter every day. So first of all, Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim is only bekitza. You don't have to say Kol Amar B'Lasap Harez and Meshubach. That's number one. Number two, Sipa Yitzias Mitzrayim Pesach night should be V'Higarta Levincha. It should be, you should tell it to someone else. When we daven Shachris and Ma'ariv, we're not talking to someone else, we're talking to ourselves. We're reciting the Parsha of Vayomer. We're reciting the Parsha of Yitzias Mitzrayim, but we're not telling it to someone else. Thirdly, Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Sipa Yitzias Mitzrayim should be derech, it should be la'acherim, derech she'ela tshuva regarding mitzvahs halayla, because that's how the Chumash describes it. Ki yisholchem binach amach aleim amah avodah hazos lachem, or mazos. Our children will ask us, what are the mitzvahs halayla all about? So then, we got to tell the bincha, we should tell Sipa Yitzias Mitzrayim by answering the questions that they'll ask regarding the mitzvahs halayla. So that's what the Manishtana is all about. In the days of the Beis Hamikdash, so the main three questions were Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. So the question of Pesach, that's the question on the Korban Pesach. Why do we eat Korban Pesach? Question on matzah. We ask on Pesach, matzah, maror. Those three questions we understand. As long as that we don't have the Korban Pesach, so we leave out that question about the Korban Pesach, tzli. But then we have another two questions. One question is about Misubin. Misubin is a mitzvah midrabanan. You should eat beheseba. How come the Mefarshim ask, how come we don't ask a question about the Arba Kaisis? So Rav Soloveitchik was fond of explaining. The Rambam writes that Arba Kaisis and Heseba are two parts of the same din. The din in our Torah is b'chol davadar chayvarim liris esatz makilu hiyatz mitzrayim. Everyone has an obligation. This is the most difficult mitzvah to fulfill on Pesach night. The mitzvah deraisa liris esatz makilu hiyatz mitzrayim. You have to have the attitude as if we just became free men tonight. That's why we're obligated to recite Hallel. It's Hallel b'shas haYeshua. We're supposed to have the feeling as if we just left Mitzrayim. Most people do not have that. Feeling. And with the Rabbanan, they instituted a mitzvah with the Rabbanan that the Rambam formulates to demonstrate that we have been echarim. How does one fulfill laharis atzmo? So the two parts to that mitzvah: to drink arba kosses, to drink a toast, and an alcoholic beverage. The slaves were not given schnapps to drink l'chaim, and to eat beheseba. The slaves were not given the freedom to eat beheseba. So when we ask the question about haseba, that includes the question about arba kosses, because they're two parts of the same mitzvah. The shaila is, what about the matbilin? What mitzvah is there in matbilin? So the Rav suggested, if you hold like the Rambam and the Yara Hazaka, he actually paskins like Rab Elazar Rab Tzaddik, that charosis is a mitzvah. So maybe the matbilim goes on the mitzvah of charosis. It's a mitzvah midarabanan. Zeichel letid, zeichel letapuach, zeichel ledam, whatever it is, a mitzvah midarabanan matbilim. In fact, the Rambam's opinion is that you dip everything into the charosis. You dip the matzah into charosis, you dip the karpas into the charosis, and you dip the mar into the charosis. All three. Only the Korban Pesach he doesn't have. You don't dip that into the charosis. It tastes good the way it is. You don't have to dip it into the charosis. But the Rambam writes, if one would have held like the other sheet that the charosis is only to kill the worm, then you would only dip the maror. But the Rambam Paschal's charosis is a mitzvah, so that's why he says you dip everything into the charosis. You dip the matzah, the maror, and the karpas. So that's if you hold charosis mitzvah. What if you hold like the chachamim, like the Rambam Paschal's in the Pirush HaMishnayos, that the charosis is not a mitzvah, it's only for health purposes to kill the worms. It's not healthy. The worms are kosher, but it's not healthy to have live worms crawling around in your stomach. So then Rav Soloveitchik suggested maybe the mitzvah that we're referring to, because the Manishtana seems to be the shailos regarding mitzvahs halayla, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Sipit Yitzias Mitzrayim, derech sheila tshuva regarding mitzvahs halayla, lacherim. You got to tell Levincha, the son is going to ask, what are the mitzvahs all about? We should explain the Tama mitzvahs by telling the whole story of Yitzias Mitzrayim. So the three mitzvahs, we understand Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And the mitzvah of Hasebu, Tarbakosis, we understand what's the Madbilim. So if you hold Charosis mitzvah, that's what we're talking about, the mitzvah of Charosis. But if you hold Charosis is not a mitzvah, it sounds like everybody said Matbilim. Even those who disagree with the Rab Lozer, Rab Tzadok hold Charosis is not a mitzvah. So Rab Soloveitchik suggested maybe the mitzvah that we're referring to, we're alluding to, is the mitzvah of Karpas. On the level of the Raisa, there's certainly no mitzvah of Karpas. Why did they require Karpas? So the simple reading in the Gemara is the Karpas is Kadesh Yishalo Atinoikas, just do another strange thing. In order to gain the interest of the children, they should want to wait up, stay up all night. They shouldn't fall asleep. They hear the whole story of Sipit Yitzias Mitzrayim. So so Rav Soloveitchik suggested maybe that's one reason. Maybe there are more reasons. Maybe in addition to that consideration, maybe that's why you have Karpas Olam in the beginning. But maybe Karpas is for whatever reason they instituted it. Maybe it's a mitzvah midirabbanan. So he pointed out two strange things in the Rambam. The Rambam, as is printed in our Rambam, the Rambam says you have to eat a kazayis of Karpas. So that goes Mamani on the bottom of the page quotes the Maram Rutenberg, his Rebbe, that it doesn't make any sense. It says just Kadesh Yishalatin, because why do you need a kazayis? And by Maror, the Rambam never says that you need kazayis. So the Maram Rutenberg, they suggest maybe it's a misprint, maybe it's a Tar Sefer, maybe the kazayis really belongs later by the Maror, it doesn't belong by the Karpas. And in fact, in Shulchan Aruch, the recommendation is also from the Maram Rutenberg, I think, that you should dafka not eat a kazayis of Karpas, because if you do, then it'll be a suffix, maybe have to say Bor Nefashis, because according to some Bali Atosed, there's a Hesach Hadas between the Bor Pri Hadama on the Karpas and the Morah that you're going to eat later. It's a long pause. So in Shulchan Aruch, the recommendation is you should dafka not have a kazayis. But the way it says in our Rambam, it says you need a kazayis. So it sounds whatever motivated the Chachamim to introduce eating of Karpas, but you have to eat a kazayis. It's a mitzvah sachila midirabbanan. Then the Rav pointed out there's another Rambam. The Rambam quotes from the Rif. In the Shulchan Aruch, they have this also. If the Balabatim didn't have an art scroll Haggadah, they didn't have Maxwell House coffee Haggadahs, they didn't have Manashemitz Haggadahs, nobody had a Haggadah. So the Balabatim didn't know how to say the Haggadah by heart. So the rabbi in the yeshivas, the Rosh Yeshiva would, all the Talmidim would be there on Pesach, and the Rosh Yeshiva would say the whole Haggadah by heart, and the Talmidim would be Yotze with Shemei Kahina. So apparently in the days of the Rambam and the Rif and the Shulchan Aruch, the rabbi would go from home to home to home. He would run through the whole Haggadah. He would say all the brachas for the Balabatim. They should be Yotze. He was being Yotze them. He was going to wait till he gets home. He's going to have his Seder at home. He wouldn't eat by the Balabatim. And all the brachas that he said, he says the Kiddush, and he says Asher Gyalano, everything he said is for the Balabatim. It wasn't saying for himself. So the Rambam says Yotze Moitzi, not only on the Kiddush, not only the Bar Piagofen of the Kiddush and Asher Gyalano and the Bichas Hashir, the Rama has Yotze Moitzi on the Bari Prihu Adoma on the Karpas. But that's a plain Bichas Hanenin. How can I say a bracha for the other Balabatim? So the Rav suggested, just like the Gemara says, you say Yotze Moitzi on the Bar Piagofen of the Kiddush, so too the Hamoitzi of Achilas Matzah. You also say Yotze Moitzi, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the end of the third parak. So it's true also on the Bar Piadoma of the Karpas. It's part of the Haggadah. It's part of the Sipit Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's not just a plain old Bichas Hanenin. No, there's a mitzvah midirabbanan to eat Karpas, and that's why we allow Yotze Moitzi He says the bar ha'adama only for the balabatim in their home. He's not being yotze himself with that. It's only for them. I'll close with one more vart. The Rav said so much on Pesachim. He can talk forever and ever. He can write a few svarim. I'll close with one more vart. The Gemara in the first parak of Pesachim comments on the drasha. Le'ira l'chocham is le'ira l'chosar. Why l'cho? Shalchoi ateroy avalat teroy shalacherim v'shal gavoy. So let's say in the middle of Chalamoid, a worker has to come to fix something. A Nachri worker comes to fix something in my home. And he brings his sandwich. He brings his ham sandwich with him. I don't have to tell him, please leave the sandwich outside of the house. There's no bal yirah. Chemtza shalacherim is not my responsibility. What if it's chemtza shal Yisrael acher? What if it's a Jewish worker comes and the Jewish worker brings with him some chametz? Is it my problem or is it his problem? So Pnei Yeshua with the Vilna Gaon, with many others, point out. Rashi writes, and acherim, Rashi writes, means nachrim. Sounds from Rashi that chemtza shel Yisrael acher, the one in whose home they brought in the sandwich, is in violation of Bal Yirah. He's not allowed to let them bring in any Jews, may not bring in chametz into my it doesn't belong to me. No, it's my Bal Yirah, but it's his Bal Yirah also, because it belongs to him, but it's my Bal Yirah. So the Achreinim Abadid, Rav Soloveitchik said the Or Chodesh is a pilpul sefer on Pesach. Remember, the Rav mentioned Or Chodesh. I went and I bought an Or Chodesh. That's the only thing that I used it for, to look up this kasha. The rest of the sefer is all pilpul. It's not our style at all. In fact, when the Chassam Sefer was a young teenager, his Rebbe recommended to him that he should go learn in Rechnitz by the Or Chodesh. So he traveled, got to Rechnitz, and he stayed there for a couple of weeks. He didn't like it at all. It wasn't his style of learning. And he came back to Ramnas Nadler. He never said boo. He was upset. Why the Rebbe sent him on a wild goose chase? Why did he send him to learn in Rechnitz? And 30 years later, that saved his life, because that's what they write. The grandson of the Chassam Sefer wrote a biography of the 3 generations, the Chutam Shulosh, biography of Rabbi Kiveger, and the Chassam Sefer was his son-in-law. Rabbi Kiveger, the Chassam Sefer, had 3 wives, one after the other. The second wife was the daughter of Rabbi Kiveger. So the 3 generations are the Rabbi Kiveger, the Chassam Sefer, and the Ksab Sefer was one of the sons of the Chassam Sefer. So this biography, the Chutam Shulosh, was written by one of the sons of the Ksab Sefer. So he writes over this story that when the Chassam Sefer was already a very prominent rabbi in Hungary, in Pressburg, he was a Yeki, he wasn't a Hungarian, but he had a Rabbanis in Pressburg. So he once paskan on a din Torah, and he gave a psak. So they arrested him because the din Torah was between 2 Jewish balabat, and one had sold merchandise to the other one that was smuggled into the country, into Hungary, without paying the import tax. So the fact that Chassam Sefer gave a psak on it, he should have not given a psak. It was against the law to smuggle it into the country. So why did the prominent rabbi give a psak? So the rabbi is also patting the balabatim on the back. It's okay to violate Din Malchusa and not to pay import tax. So they want to punish him. They want to put him in prison. So they were holding by putting him in prison. So in court, they always have policemen to make sure nobody makes a riot. So one of the policemen that would participate in the hearings. So the policeman said to the judge, Your Honor, could I ask the defendant a question? The first time it ever happened. So he said, yeah, ask him whatever you want. He asks him, did you ever live in Rechnitz? So he says, yeah, 30 years ago, he lived in Rechnitz for a few weeks. He says, Your Honor, the man is innocent. He didn't do any crime. He says, I remember I was a policeman then 30 years ago in Rechnitz, and I had to stand. Each policeman has his beat where he has to stand, where he walks. He was stationed in front of the synagogue, and all the children, the Jews and the non-Jews, all the children, everyone, then no one had any respect for me. No one gave any derech eretz to the policeman. The only one was this youngster. He was a teenager then. He every morning he would say, good morning, officer, with such derech eretz for the government. I can't believe it that now that he's such a prominent rabbi, he's going to let the balabatim cheat. And the Chassam Sefer said he didn't know that it was brought in illegal. He didn't know what the merchandise was. They just had it in Torah about mekach toyos, about the price. He didn't know that it was brought in b'yisa. So he got off the hook because of that. So So that was the Or Chodesh. The Rav Nosson Nadler sent the Chassam Sofer to learn by the Or Chodesh, and the Chassam Sofer didn't like the Derech Halimud. So he went back. So after 30 years, he realized the Rebbe sent him to Rechnitz to save his life later, that they shouldn't put him in prison later. Anyway, so I remember the Rav, when we were learning Pesachim, he mentioned Or Chodesh has a kasha. How can the Pnei Yeshua, how can these Achreinim say that Rashi holds Chemta Shal Yisrael Acher, you violate by your It's against the Beferish Mishnah and Daf Mem Vav. Amar Aleph going over Talmud base. The Mishnah discusses Kates Mafrish and Chala Betumah B'Yontav. How you mafresh Chala? You're mixing flour with water, and if you're going to leave it too long, it's going to turn into chametz. So you want to bake it, but you have to be mafresh Chala. But it's going to be Chala Tmeya. Chala Tmeya, no one's allowed to eat, so you're not allowed to bake on Yontav. You're not allowed to bake Chala Tmeya. You're going to throw the Chala out. There's a malacha to cook anything on Yontav is a malacha. If you plan to eat it, then it's ochal nefesh. But it was challah tmei, you're not allowed to eat it. So the Mishnah says, what's he going to do? He can't bake the challah. It's going to turn out that it's going to become chametz. Isn't he going to violate bayirah bayimatzeh? So the Tana says in the Mishnah, Ein ze chametz shemeshar mala b'bayirah bayimatzeh. There's no bayirah on this because it doesn't belong to you. So who doesn't belong to? It belongs to the Kohanim. So the Kohanim are Jewish. So how can the Pnei Yeshua and the Vilna go, and how can they say in Rashi, the Chemtza Shal Yisrael Acher, you're in violation of Bal Yeroah? It's against the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ein ze chametz shemeshar mala b'bayirah bayimatzeh. So Rav Soloveitchik pointed out, if you look in the Rashi and Mem Vav on the base, Rashi himself says, befavorish the teretz to the kasha. Rashi says, it doesn't belong to any other Jew because he didn't give it to the Kohen yet. Now it belongs to Shevet Kahuna. Shevet Kahuna is like a goy. Shevet Kahuna is a concept. It's not a group of people. Shevet Kahuna is an abstract organization that's not human beings. So Shevet Kahuna, just like a goy, is a bailam who's a la bar hoche bal yirah by matzeh. So therefore, his chametz is mufke from the din of bal yirah. The chametz shal hegdish also. The ownership of the chametz shal hegdish is chal Hashem hegdish. It's a chal Hashem bailam. So hegdish is not muzar bal yirah by matzeh. So Shevet Kahuna is also. It's a chal Hashem bailam. It's like a corporation. It's not a group of. It's not a shutfis. Not a group of people who are Jewish. Whenever the chametz belongs to an ownership who is not subject to the din of Bal Yirah by Matzah, that's either Hegdish or Akum or Shevet Kahuna. So then there's no Bal Yirah by Matzah. Once they'll give it to a Kohen, then it'll be the private ownership of that Kohen. So Rashi said, didn't give it to the Kohen yet. Right now it belongs to Shevet Kahuna. Shevet Kahuna is the same as Akum, same as Gavoy. That's how the Rab said. He said, Rashi himself asked the Kasha of the Or Chodesh, and he gives the teretz. The Rab had chidushim on every page himself. Again, Mazel Tov. On the same of the Masechet, you should be zeichet to make many Masiyumim. And you should all celebrate. We should all celebrate Pesach in good health. And we should all be zeichet to see the Gulo HaTzida. Big Korah.
Thank you so much, Rav Schachter. One of the questions, we heard a shir 2 days ago from Rav Weiss, and we wanted to ask the Rebbe as well a similar question about the Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbos, and that falls out before Pesach, Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. The issue of if you wake up late and you only have enough time to either daven or to eat lechem mishnah, what would Rebbe's suggestion be to do?
I don't know. What I said. I would think you're not allowed to eat before Shachris.
That's of course. No, but I'm saying what would egg matzah make a regular matzah?
No, regular matzah. A lot of people don't want to have chametz in the house at all this coming Shabbos. So Friday night I'll be pashtus. You can have regular matzah, lechem mishnah regular matzah. There's a discussion. The din and in Yerushalmi that you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach, does it only apply by Yom, or does it even apply Leil Yud Dalet? So Rab Soloveitchik always used to say, Rab Chaim, his grandfather used to say that you're permitted to have matzah Leil Yud Dalet, because we say in the Manishtana, this means last night we could eat either chametz or matzah. So last night is Leil Yud Dalet. So if you want, you can have regular shmura matzah on Leil Yud Dalet, or pshuta matzah, whatever. You can have a lechem mishnah with matzah. You're not mechuyev to be machma on this. Then the pashtus is that you can have egg matzah. You don't have to wake up in such an early minute. Pashtus is that you can have egg matzah in the morning for the lechem mishnah, and you can have egg matzah for shalosh shudas after mincha. You daven mincha in the afternoon, The Ramah says that Ashkenazim have a chumrah, a very big chumrah, a wild chumrah, to be choshesh for Rashi's opinion. Rashi writes on Lamed Vav Amud Aleph that may parents are not machmitzim means it doesn't become chametz dog and gomer, but it'll be memaher lahachmitz tchilas hachimas, so it'll become chametz nuksha. So according to Rashi, you shouldn't eat any matzah that was baked with may paris because maybe they weren't able to handle it, to control it properly. Maybe it became chametz. Maybe they didn't realize. Maybe it became chametz. So that's a big chumrah. The Achronim don't even understand why such a chumrah developed over the years, such a big chumrah. So the pashtus is that chumrah only applies on the 7 days of Pesach. It doesn't apply on Erev Pesach. The Gemara has a chumrah, the chametz is b'mashu. And the chumrah of the Gemara doesn't apply on Erev Pesach. Machlokes and Yeridei. The Rambam holds that chametz b'mashu even on Erev Pesach. Because the Rambam holds the reason why chametz is b'mashu because davar sheish l'matir. So even on Erev Pesach is also davar sheish matir. But we don't accept the Rambam's opinion. We hold that chametz is b'mashu. It's not a davar sheish l'matir. Chametz avar la Pesach is going to be also. It's a davar she'ein l'matirin. And it's b'mashu because of chumrah dekoris. It's only b'mashu on Pesach. On Erev Pesach, chametz is not b'mashu. So this chumrah not to eat egg matzahs, not all Pesach only is mutter l'cholim b'skenin because mikra din it's really mutter. It's a big chumrah. So the chumrah was only introduced on Pesach gufa. On Erev Pesach it doesn't apply. Because if you're going to read the Ramah that the Ramah asas egg matzah after this man is chametz. And our Pesach, then the Sholem Eshev says it's a steer to the Ramah and Taf Ayin Aleph. Ramah says beferish that you can eat the matzah ashira on our Pesach all day long, not just in the morning until 11:30. All day long you can eat it. So the pashtus in the Ramah is that the Ramah says you don't have to lo hitrichu chachamim. The Chok Yankov writes like this, and the Rav Herschel Schachter writes like that. The Ramah just meant to say, you're not mechuyev to pashkezech to make egg matzah, especially in order to have shalashudas. They never in Europe. They never had egg matzah. The matzah companies didn't manufacture egg matzah, but in America or so where it's available, so of course you should buy egg matzah and use the egg matzah for shalashudas after mincha. Daven mincha in the afternoon on Shabbos, then after mincha you have your shalashudas. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have egg matzah. I think we're going to have egg matzah Friday night also. Friday night and Shabbos morning and shalashudas. After mincha.
Rav Schachter, how much egg matzah would you eat? Would it be like a whole? Is it like cake? Would you have a half a matzah, a whole egg matzah?
It's like cake. It's like cake. You see, my wife used to make all the time chalas for Shabbos, egg chalas. So I have students who are Sfardim. So some of them come to eat by me on Shabbos. They have to bring their own chalas because they say mezainis and my wife's cake. So we paskin that even if you have cake, but if it's part of a filling meal, you're going to eat a whole meal. And at the end of the meal, you're going to be full. So the Igros Moshe quotes the Mishnah Berurah, who quotes the Magen Avraham. That's how Ashkenazim paskin. That's called Kviyas Suda. You don't have to eat 4 beitzim of the cake. If you eat a little bit of kazais of cake in a meal that's going to be filling, the cake becomes amoitzi. You have to wash, you have to say amoitzi, and you have to say birchas hamazon. Chacham Avadia doesn't accept anything from Ashkenazim, so he doesn't accept that. So he says that's Magen Avraham. Those are Ashkenazim. Magen Avraham and the Mishnah Berurah and Rav Moshe Feinstein. These are Ashkenazim. So the Sfardim who come to me, they bring water chalas and they say their own hamoitzi. Because if they're gonna eat cake, they're gonna have to eat 4 kibbetzim of cake. But with the Ashkenazim, we don't paskin like Chacham Avadia. We follow our traditional paskin, Magen Avraham, and the Mishnah Berurah, that if you eat it as part of a meal, that's also called the Kviyas Suda.
Okay, thank you. Shkach.
Anyone else have any questions for the Rosh Yeshiva?
If it's possible to ask an off-topic question, sometimes in the Masechet we came across the union of nosar, not just by the Korban Pesach, but also in general. Is there a problem in actually leaving a kazayas of the Pesach or other kudshim past the deadline, or is the problem only eating it past the deadline?
No, there's a lot of sirim and that's an avera. There's a machlekes hatanan whether you get malchus because it's a lab shem b'maisa. It's a lav anitik le'esei. So there are two reasons why you're not like it, but it certainly is a lav. Loisasirim and ad boiker. Not a lot of levo.
And the Issa kares is only if you're eating it?
Only if you eat it, yeah. Only if you eat it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question about halacha l'maisa korban Pesach? Since obviously korban Pesach is not a chiyuv of the Beis Hamikdash, necessarily having the Beis Hamikdash, one could, in theory, l'malach l'maisa, have the korban Pesach bizmanenu. What does Rebbe think about having korban Pesach bizman hazeh, and what are the political ramifications involved here? To overtake the halachic ramifications? How does Rebbe paskin or his Walton Shang on this position?
When you bring a korban Pesach, you have to have a mizbech. So you're going to have to make a mizbech. We assume that there's a machlokes, the Rambam and the Ravid, whether the Makam HaMikdash is Kitshel Silava, I like Kitshel Silava. So according to the Rambam, the Makam HaMikdash still retains the Kedusha. So if you want to make a mizbech, you have to make it in the Baisheni period. The mizbech was Lamed Beis Amos and Lamed Beis Amos on the floor. So the mizbech has to be a perfect square. Doesn't have to be a cube, but it has to be a square, and it has to be somewhere within that Lamed Beis Amos, Lamed Beis Amos. So we're not sure exactly how long an Amma is, but we know, roughly speaking, where the Makam HaMizbech was in the Baisheni period, and you can make a Mizbech, an Amma, Alama, within that Lamed Beis Amos. So that, in Metzius, it wouldn't be such a problem. Yeah, but the Ravid holds that the Makam HaMikdash is Likit Shalasi Lovain. And in the days of the Rishonim, many of the Jewish people used to go, the Rishonim quote, used to go to daven on the Makam HaMikdash because they followed the opinion of the Ravid that like the Miri writes like that in Shavuos, that like it shalasi lovas. According to the Ravid, the Beis HaMikdash does not have kedusha. So the suggestion was made, so we'll make a bama. So you can't make a bama somewhere else. According to the Rambam, there's an Isa bamas. So you make a bama in the Makam HaMizbech where it is. So the Pashta says you can't make a bama. The Mishnah says, Yerushalayim ein achrei heter. There's no heter bamas after the Churban Abayis. So because of the machlokes, the Rambam and the Ravid, we don't have any hachra. So we go the Chumrah in both directions. If you all like Kitchalasi Lava, like the Ravid, then you don't have a Kedusha Samakam. So you can't just make a Mizbeach. The Mizbeach will be considered a bama. And there's no heter bamas today. Yerushalayim ein achrei heter. So we're stuck. We can't. In the days of the Rishonim, there's a Sefer Kafta Vaferach written. There was an aliyah of to Eretz Yisrael, a group of Bali Atosas came with their families, and then years later, another aliyah. So one of those who went on the later aliyah, 40 years later, writes a whole Sefer Kafta Vaferach. He writes all the dinim that you have to know, Trumas and Ma'aser, Shemitah v'Yovel, all the dinim that you have to know, Yantav Sheni Shel Goliath, all the dinim that are relevant. So he writes, he heard that in the earlier aliyah, 40 years earlier, that they were discussing the possibility of bringing a korban Pesach. So he says, how can they bring a korban Pesach? Everybody's tummy. So then around 10, 15 chapters later in this Sefer Kafta Vaferach, he writes, oh, that's not a kasha. What I asked 15 chapters ago is a silly question, because the din is that everybody's tummy said, Tuma is muta b'tziba. Tuma is muta b'tziba. But there's so many other problems. You have to have Kohanim with big dekuna. You have to know what the big dekuna look like. Tzvi Hirsch wrote a whole sefer called Drishas Tzia. So he was a Talmud of Rabbi Kivega. He has his ha'aris printed in Yeridei on the bottom of the page, the Tzvila Tzadik. Strong ha'aris on Yeridei. It was a big Talmud Chacham. So he wrote a whole sefer Drishas Tzia about the possibility of building a Mizbeach and bringing korban Pesach. He thought that he solved all the problems. But he didn't really solve all the problems. There's still more problems. It's just not politically. It's just a mitzvah in halacha that one of the problems that he did solve was the following. Some had the taina. It says in Sefer Ezra Nehemiah, it says when they built the second Beis Hamikdash, they tried to ascertain which kohanim were kohanim miyuchasim. If you couldn't produce a Sefer Yuchsin that has who your father was, or your grandfather was, or your great-grandfather was, all the way back to Kohanim Ksherim, who did Avodah in the Bais Rishon, you're only a Kohen Kohanei Chazokeh, not Kohanim Yuchasim, then they wouldn't allow you to be Makar Kabbalah. So today, there are very few Kohanim Miyuchasim, hardly, not enough Kohanim Miyuchasim to run a Beis HaMikdash. So Tzvi Hirsch Kaldashe came up with a Chiddush that the requirement for Kohanim Miyuchasim is only a Chumrah Midrabanan that was invented at that time by Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's self-understood. It's only Hecha de Efsher. If you'll be able to bring Karbonis, even though you'll insist you need Kohanim Miyuchasim, so be it, be machma. But if you live in a generation where if you'll insist on Kohanim Miyuchasim, you just make it impossible to bring Karbonis, the Ki Hagavna, the Chumrah doesn't apply. So Rabbi Kivega was masking with that, and the Chassam Sofer was masking. Rabbi Kivega sent the Sefer to the Chassam Sofer. Tzvi Kalisha was a Talmud of Rabbi Kivega, so he sent a copy of the Sefer Drishas Sion to Rabbi Kivega. He was masking to that. Then Rabbi Kivega sent the Sefer to the Chassam Sofer, his son-in-law. He was masking. So that was a change in Psak. You look in the Pischei Tshuva and Ebenezer. Until the days of Rabbi Kivega, they used to assume, like the earliest Sfardish Achronim, the Kohanim today are Safek Kohanim. And then they changed the Psak. They're not Safek Kohanim, they're Vade Kohanim. The requirement that only a Kohen Miyuchas can be Makro Karbonis in the Beis HaMikdash was only a Chumer with the Rabbanan, Hecha de Efsher. And Mizman is a Hecha de Efsher Darfmanish. You can live without it, you can be Makro Karbonis without it. So that problem he solved, we accept that solution, that you don't really need Kohanim Miyuchasim, that his opinion was accepted. But the other issue, how can you resolve the issue? According to the Ravid, there's no Kedushas HaMokam. Bokam HaMikdash doesn't have Kedusha. You can't make a Mizbech. So Tzvi Kalisha thought, you'll make a Mizbech, so it'll be Manavshach. According to the Rambam, it'll be the Mizbech. According to the Ravid, it'll be a Bama G'dayla. So all the poskim say, there's no het to Bamas Bizman Hazeh. Even if you hold like Kitcha Lasi Lave, there's no het to Bamas Bizman Hazeh. We're hoping
possible to do it on Tanai? Can you do that on Tanai? If we're going to the Rambam, that it's like then the Mizbeach would be good.
Mizbeach. And if it's according to the Rabbi, let it be a Bama. So that's what they say. Two arguments. First of all, there's no het to Bamas Bizman Hazeh, period. Even if you hold like Kitcha Lasi Lave, that's the Taisus in Megillah. Quotes Rab Chaim Kohen says like that. Even if you hold like Kitcha Lasi Lave, there's still no het to Bamas. The Gemara some places says if there's lo kitcha lo, then there is a het bamas. Now Chaim Cohen says it's not necessarily correct. There are Gemaras that contradict it. And secondly, they say there's a sifra that you can make a bama in the Makam HaMikdash. Het bamas is somewhere else, but not in the Makam HaMikdash. You can't have a het bama. So we're stuck. We'll have to wait till Leo Hanavi will come, till Moshiach will come, and be Mekadosh the Makam HaMikdash l'chol hadayis.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rav Schachter, for spending time with our Kahila. We're so grateful, and Bezrat Hashem, we hope we'll have the schus of learning more and more Torah from Rosh Hashiva. It's a big schus, and this should be Leilu Nishmas Marino Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, whose yahrzeit is coming up on the fourth day of Chol Moed, and we thank you so much, Rav Schachter, for your time. And Menochal min Azvach min Pesachim, may we be zochet to learn your Torah and be able to practice it l'halach l'maisa on the Beis HaMikdash with a proper mizbeach, with the proper kohanim. B'mehera b'yameinu. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yashikov.
Go home too.